If the internet were to disappear forever, the world would face a disruption of epic proportions. It's hard to imagine a world without the internet, but what if it happened suddenly? No warning, no time to prepare. One day the internet is just gone. It's more than just a convenience for watching videos or checking social media. The internet is woven into nearly every aspect of our lives, from how we work to how we shop, communicate, and even travel. The first few hours would likely be pure confusion. People would notice that their Wi-Fi is down and they'd check their phones to see if it's just them. As they realize that it's not an issue with their devices, panic would start to set in. Those who rely on the internet for work, whether it's remote jobs, communication, or even accessing files stored in the cloud, would immediately hit a wall. Offices would close, workers would be stuck without access to crucial information, and projects would grind to a halt. Without email or the ability to contact colleagues or clients, people would feel completely isolated. But it's not just office workers who would be affected. Most people's daily lives have become entangled with the internet. You wouldn't be able to order food from your favorite restaurant or use apps like Uber or Lyft to get around. Online banking, gone. People would be left wondering how to manage their finances without access to their accounts, or digital payment methods like PayPal or Venmo. Even basic tasks like checking the weather or looking up a phone number would become monumental challenges. For some, the lack of internet would be almost surreal. Schools and universities would shut down. Kids and students who rely on the internet for homework, research, or online learning programs would be left with nothing. Teachers who are accustomed to using the web for lesson plans, research, and classroom materials would find themselves scrambling for alternatives. The educational system would be hit hard, and it would take weeks or even months to reestablish the kinds of systems we rely on for learning. And then there are the emergency services. Hospitals, police stations, and fire departments all rely on the internet for communication, coordination, and patient information. Without access to hospital databases, doctors and nurses could struggle to provide proper care, emergency response teams would be severely hampered, and the lack of communication could lead to delays and confusion during critical moments. In the first few hours, the world would be left with a feeling of collective loss, as if an essential part of modern life has simply vanished. It's easy to take the internet for granted when it's working fine, but without it, the weight of its absence would be felt everywhere. While people would initially try to go about their daily lives, the glaring absence of something that holds everything together would quickly become apparent. As things start to settle in, the world would begin to realize just how dependent we've become on the internet. What happens next is where things would get even more interesting. Would the world find a way to adapt, or would society begin to unravel in unexpected ways? That's where things would really start to get complicated, and the answers wouldn't be clear right away. This was just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next part, where we'll dive deeper into the long-term effects of the internet disappearing and how it would affect everything from businesses to personal relationships. As the hours turn into days, the true scale of the internet's disappearance becomes apparent. People start to adjust to the initial shock, but they quickly realize that without the internet, everything is slower, harder, and less efficient. Global communication, once instantaneous, grinds to a halt. Phone lines, once an alternative to email, are now overloaded with calls as businesses try to connect with clients, suppliers, and partners. But without the ability to quickly exchange information, companies struggle to meet deadlines or continue operations. International trade would face a massive blow. Global supply chains rely heavily on the internet for real-time inventory tracking, shipments, and communication between buyers and suppliers across time zones. Without the internet, transportation logistics would break down. Goods would still be moving, but not with the speed and coordination that we've come to expect. This would lead to delays in everything from the manufacturing of products to the delivery of essential goods like medicine, food, and electronics. The financial markets would be another major casualty. Stock exchanges, reliant on the internet for transactions, would come to a standstill. Traders and investors wouldn't be able to make real-time decisions, and without access to financial news, there would be a severe lack of information on market conditions. In fact, it's likely that the markets would crash, at least temporarily, as panic sets in. Digital banking systems would stop, and people's access to their savings, investments, and other financial services would be blocked. This could lead to widespread uncertainty and potentially even economic collapse. The lack of the internet would also expose just how deeply we rely on digital services for healthcare. Hospitals and medical facilities use the internet for everything, from patient records to medical research and telemedicine doctors and nurses would be unable to access critical health data, potentially putting lives at risk. While hospitals would still function without the internet, the loss of connected systems would drastically affect their ability to provide efficient care. Additionally, the lack of access to online pharmacies and telehealth services would prevent many from receiving the treatments they depend on. Meanwhile, social isolation would become a growing issue. For many, social media and messaging apps are vital for staying connected with friends, family, and loved ones. Without these tools, people would feel cut off from their social circles. While traditional forms of communication, like phone calls and face-to-face meetings, would still exist, the convenience and reach of the internet would no longer be there. People would have to turn to older ways of staying in touch, such as writing letters or making long-distance phone calls, both of which would be far slower and less efficient than what they're used to. The entertainment industry would also struggle. Streaming services, online gaming, and digital media platforms would vanish overnight. People would have to turn back to physical forms of entertainment like DVDs and CDs, but those options are limited in a world where we've been conditioned to get instant access to movies, music, and shows. With live streaming events and social media influencers no longer able to share their content online, many entertainment companies would be forced to adapt quickly, perhaps by returning to more traditional forms of media production and distribution. In the immediate aftermath, people might start turning to alternatives to the internet. For example, offline networks could emerge with individuals creating makeshift communication systems to share information, but these would be inefficient, local, and unsustainable for global-scale problems. In the short term, people might also seek out more in-person activities and interactions, but the reliance on the internet for everything from shopping to education to socializing would create significant gaps in everyday life. As the world continues to adjust, governments would likely have to intervene. They'd need to address the economic and social crises that are unfolding, providing support to businesses, healthcare systems, and individuals who are struggling to adapt. Meanwhile, countries with less advanced infrastructure may face even more severe challenges. Without the internet, the digital divide between rich and poor countries would grow even wider, as wealthier nations have more resources to cope with the loss. The early days without the internet would be chaotic, but the longer it went on, the harder it would be to cope with the loss. In the next part, we'll explore the long-term consequences of a world without the internet and how it could affect everything from education to global politics. Within the first few weeks to a couple of months after the internet disappears forever, the deeper and more complex consequences start to unfold. By now, the initial panic has shifted into confusion and frustration, especially as people realize this is not a temporary outage. Without any sign of it returning, every industry, government, and household has to fully adapt to a world where online access no longer exists. And it's not just about finding alternatives, it's about rebuilding everything. By the third or fourth week, most businesses that relied on cloud computing or web-based tools start to completely shut down. Companies that offered services through apps, like food delivery, ride sharing, or online banking, have either collapsed or shifted to slower, outdated systems. Employees can no longer work from home unless they're using offline tools, and office life begins to resemble the late 20th century again. Fax machines make a comeback, paper memos are posted on walls, meetings happen face-to-face or through landline conference calls. Some companies just can't keep up, and mass layoffs start happening across multiple sectors. Retail stores begin seeing more foot traffic, but they're overwhelmed. Many of them use the internet for inventory, supply chain tracking, or even basic checkout functions. Without those systems, shelves are disorganized and restocking becomes inconsistent. Cashiers manually enter prices, and long lines become a common part of everyday shopping. Customers are confused, upset, and constantly waiting for a process that used to take just seconds. Meanwhile, governments around the world are under pressure to maintain control and stability. In the absence of online banking, citizens start showing up at physical bank branches in massive numbers, trying to withdraw money or get answers. There are long waits, paper forms, and even rationing of cash in some areas. Countries that had digital-only services like online tax filing or benefits portals have to rapidly shift to phone lines and walk-in offices, creating long delays and frustration. Transportation systems are hit hard too. Airlines that once relied on digital ticketing and scheduling now struggle to operate with handwritten manifests and in-person bookings. Railways and cargo transport lose the ability to track shipments, and some companies stop deliveries altogether. Ports and customs offices can't process goods efficiently without internet-based records. This slows global trade dramatically. Goods, pile up at ports and warehouses, and by the second month, certain items like electronics, imported food, and medicine start to disappear from shelves. The world of medicine faces a quiet crisis. Many hospitals had digital records, online appointment systems, and automated prescription tracking. Without those, medical staff revert to paperwork, which takes longer and leads to more mistakes. Pharmacies struggle to confirm prescriptions. Some patients go without their medications for days. Specialized medical knowledge that was once shared quickly online now travels by mail, fax, or courier, creating delays in treatment, especially in rural or remote areas. In schools, students and teachers adjust to new routines. Online learning disappears entirely. Printed materials return and homework is collected in person. Communication with parents happens by phone or paper notes. It's a huge adjustment, especially for older students who relied on digital platforms for assignments, research, and grades. Teachers are stretched thin trying to manage classrooms without any online help, and many schools see lower attendance as parents struggle to balance their own work without digital tools. Media also changes drastically. With no social media or streaming, people turn to television, radio, and newspapers again. But with fewer resources and slower information flow, it's harder to keep people updated on what's happening around the world. Rumors spread faster than facts. People begin to rely more on their communities, local stations, and even word of mouth for news and updates. Some newspapers see a small revival, but they can't compete with the instant updates people were used to before. By the end of the second month, it's clear that this is not just a digital issue. It's a complete reshaping of modern life. What started as confusion has turned into a full cultural and societal reset. The world is slower, more isolated, and more fragile. And for many, the question remains, how do you rebuild a world that depended on something you can't get back? By the time a full year has passed without the internet, the world would look and feel completely different. It wouldn't just be about adjusting to slower ways of working or finding alternatives to streaming movies or ordering food. It would be about living in a world that has lost one of its central systems. Culturally, politically, and globally, life would be reshaped in ways people never expected. Social life would be one of the biggest changes. Without the internet, global connection would fade. Long-distance friendships and family relationships that once survived through video calls, messaging apps, or social media would weaken. People would have to rely on letters, landline calls, or even occasional travel just to keep in touch. For younger generations who grew up with digital communication, this would feel like a major loss of connection to the outside world. In fact, entire generations would start growing up never knowing what it was like to go online. The internet, once so central to everyday life, would become more like a historical era. People would tell stories about it the way older generations talk about rotary phones or black and white television. This shift would also bring changes in identity, entertainment, and how people express themselves. With no social media, people would rely more on face-to-face interaction, writing, or local gatherings to share their ideas, art, or opinions. Politically, the disappearance of the internet would shift power in unexpected ways. Governments that once relied on online platforms for communication, campaigning, or digital voting would have to return to traditional methods. This might sound like a return to simpler times, but it would also leave room for manipulation. With slower news cycles and fewer ways to fact-check claims, people could be more easily swayed by misinformation or propaganda. State-run media would become more powerful in some countries, especially those with strict control over newspapers and television. International relations would also change. Countries that relied heavily on global internet infrastructure, especially for intelligence gathering, communication between allies, and cybersecurity, would have to build new systems. Diplomatic talks that once happened through secure online channels would be slowed down. Cyber attacks would no longer be a threat, but new types of threats might emerge. Spying, surveillance, and information wars would evolve into new forms, relying more on physical methods and old-school tactics. The world economy would also keep shifting. Global stock markets, which were once monitored and traded in real time online, would need to operate on delayed data or return to in-person trading floors. This would make markets more volatile, less predictable, and much harder to manage. Investors would have to rely on physical documents, landline calls, and slower updates, making fast decisions almost impossible. Banking systems would have adapted by now, but it wouldn't be easy. People would no longer check their balances on their phones or transfer money in seconds. Everything would be done at the bank, in person, or by paper. Credit and debit card use would still exist, but would rely on offline systems that are more prone to errors and fraud. Digital banking, once the norm, would become a thing of the past. Culturally, music, movies, and books would go back to physical forms. There would be a rise in bookstores, DVD rentals, and in live music events. Artists would have to find new ways to share their work, and people would begin forming smaller local fan communities instead of global ones. This could actually bring some positives, like more support for local artists or small businesses, but it would also mean fewer people getting discovered on a global scale. Looking forward, rebuilding the internet wouldn't just be a matter of flipping a switch. The loss of infrastructure, the shift in society, and the economic chaos would make it nearly impossible to recreate what we once had. People would be forced to rethink everything. How they connect, how they share, how they live. And maybe in the middle of all this change, the world would ask a new question. Should we even bring the internet back at all? Or would people begin to see this new, slower life as something worth holding on to? That's a question that might not have a clear answer, but it's one the whole world would have to face.